Good evening, class. In the prior video, we discussed the first three meditations in Descartes' Meditations on first philosophy. This is where we explored his three skeptical worries concerning the insane, dreams, and the evil genius. We then saw the Cartesian dualism, him relating himself to a thinking thing and suspending judgment on whether or not the external world or the world of extension exists, and in particular to himself, his body. And in the third meditation, we saw a proof for the existence of God, an ontological proof. And with that proof, we have the derivative premise that God is not a deceiver. So in these next three So in this video, I'm going to summarize and give a bit of reflection on the final three meditations, 4, 5, and 6. So after 3, he proceeds to the fourth, and he has that God exists, that he is a thinking thing, and that God is not a deceiver. He finds that God has given him his reasoning ability, but at the same time, he knows that sometimes he makes errors. And since God is not a deceiver, since the error does not come from God, he asks himself, well, how do errors occur? Because if he can find out how errors occur, he can prevent them. And then if he can prevent them, he can know for certain that he is, when he uses his reasoning ability about either concepts or the external world, that he will have accurate knowledge. And so this is what he's aiming for. And so again, he reflects that he's a thinking thing, that thought has many components to it. One of those components is the intellect or the understanding, and the other is the will. And so he believes that error occurs when we use this reasoning ability improperly. And what he means by improperly, particular, is when the will exceeds the intellect. We have unlimited will, he believes. Of all of our mental faculties, the will is the closest that resembles the divine because the will is infinite, right? And so when we make a judgment on something using the will before our understanding has fully um, conceptualized the what we're making the judgment on in a clear and distinct way, error can occur. But when we first use the understanding to apprehend a situation in a clear and distinct way, and only then make a judgment after that, he finds that error will not occur. And so this is what he's aiming for. The intellect, using reason, can accurately grasp the world conceptually. And if we wait until we've done that, then we can use the will to make an accurate judgment about the external world or about concepts. So with that, he moves to the fifth meditation, and at this point he makes the claim that you can prove that the external world exists, but he doesn't do that until the sixth meditation. He again begins to reflect on clear and distinct concepts. And in the fifth meditation is where his second ontological proof for the existence of God comes into being. Right? And so again, he's focusing on the intellect as opposed to the imagination. Again, he sort of runs through that proof. Instead of using the human being at a distance to be conceptually grasped, he uses the concept of chaleagon. A chaleagon is a polygon with 1,000 sides. And so you could never utilize the imagination to imagine an object with 1,000 sides. Your mind just could not do it. But conceptually, you can sort of grasp, oh, there's an object and it has 1,000 sides. I understand what the concept is, but my imagination is limited in the detail of actually causing an object like that to be conceptually before my mind. But I can still grasp it conceptually. So he says that the most clear and distinct concept is the concept of God. and that the concept of God is perfect, and that a being with 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 perfection, with a being with perfection, its essence or its concept is not separate from its existence. These two things are not divided conceptually, and therefore, if its essence and its existence is not divided, it must, its essence implies its existence. Now, this seems like a bit of a convoluted argument. There has been other sort of more elaborate arguments on the ontological argument. Probably the best one is by Norman Malcolm, in which he sort of puts this in a logical way. I'll summarize it really quickly before we move on to the sixth meditation. So he basically says God either always existed or never existed from the concept of God. Um, and therefore, God's existence is either necessary or impossible. And the reason he looks at this premise is because if God was a being that could be created, then that would limit God's power and God would not be God. So God, by conceptual definition, either has always existed or never existed, which means God's existence is either impossible or necessary. And then when we use the word impossible, we don't mean unlikely. We're using it in a logical sense, logically impossible. So we think of some things that are logically impossible. We think of maybe like a round square or something like that. And God's existence isn't like this. It's not impossible. So therefore, it's necessary. And from that, we sort of deduce the existence of God through the very concept of God. So these are ontological forms of arguments. So with this, Descartes moves to his sixth and final meditation, in which he aims to prove that objects in the external world exist. He begins again by reflecting on the fact that um, mentality, in his in his faculties as a thinking thing, he has both an intellect and an imagination. And he says, if I'm just a thinking thing, I wouldn't need the imagination. The intellect would be sufficient. So what is the imagination and where does it come from? And he theorizes, again, and in the most clear and distinct way he can, that the imagination must come from the body. And therefore, he thinks that the body must therefore exist. And with this, he feels that he's proven the existence of the body. And so he realizes that he perceives objects in the external world, many objects in the external world, in a clear and distinct way, but he doesn't know the source of those objects. And he says, well, the source comes from one of three things. It either comes from my mind, in which case the objects wouldn't necessarily be in an external world. It comes from God, in which they would be in the mind of God and not in the external world. Or the third option, the perception of the object comes from the object in the external world. And he says, well, how do I know which of the three it is? And so he says, I don't think that it comes from my mind because I can't control it at will, right? I just perceive objects, but I can't control that perception. I either see it or I don't. I hear something or I don't, but I don't have control over that. So it doesn't seem like it comes from my mind. He says it could come from God, but again, God is not a deceiver, which he's established for his own sufficiency in the third meditation. Um, and therefore, and because God is not a deceiver, and it appears as though it comes from the object, if it really came from God, God in a sense would be deceiving me. So the third option is the one that he's left with, that the perceptions that appear as though they come from the object actually do come from the object. And if one uses one's reasoning ability to clearly and distinctly apprehend the concept of this object um, from the perception one gets over time, one can have a certainty that those objects exist in the external world. So this is where he sort of almost finishes his proof of of not only God, the immortality of the soul, uh, that his concepts are real, and that the external world is real. But he is worried about other sensations, whether they are real, because they don't seem clear and distinct. These are such as pain or hunger. And he uses the analogy of a sailor on a ship to sort of show the contrast from our particular predicament, right? He says, concepts such as pain or hunger are not really always clear and distinct, and that's different from, say, a sailor who is in this analogy representing our mind, and on a ship, the ship represents her body, and the sailor can look in a very clear and distinct way and say, ah, the ship has become damaged, or ah, the ship needs supplies. Supplies in this analogy being food, and the need being hunger, damage to the ship being pain, and the fixing it of the ship meaning the alleviation of pain. And so assessing the damage or assessing the needs of a vessel can be done in a very clear and distinct way, whereas the pain we feel or the hunger we feel seems a bit more indistinct. And Descartes theorizes this is because the body and the mind are connected. Um, how are they connected if they're two completely different substances? This later becomes the mind-body problem, which he's not really able to solve. He claims that they're connected uh, at the pineal gland, but he doesn't really give a what we might call a convincing justification for this. He just sort of says, "Oh, they're connected there." Right? And so he says things like hunger, things like pain are clear and distinct enough, and that's essentially where he leaves it. So this is essentially has been a summary of the six meditations of Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. One thing to note is that not much later on, um, David Hume, first in the Treatise on Human Nature and then on the Inquiries Concerning Human Understanding, will essentially refute Descartes' ontological argument by claiming a different source for the concept of God. Hume will argue that the concept of God just is sort of an elaboration of the concept of the human mind. We experience our minds, which are finite, and then we just sort of add infinite qualities to them, and we come up with the concept of God. But it is still based on the empirical observations or introspective observations of our own mind, and then we just sort of make these finite qualities infinite, and from there we have the concept of God. So it's not a formative cause, according to Hume, that is equal to the concept itself, which proves the existence of God. Rather, it's just a sort of elaborating of a concept that gives us the concept of God. So, depending on whether you are convinced by Descartes' ontological arguments or his method, or if you're more convinced by the argument shortly thereafter by Hume questioning uh, these ideas that from the concept of God we can get the existence of God, will definitely affect how you view the situation after Descartes. One thing to consider is whether Descartes has provided us any greater certainty concerning our situation of knowledge, or whether, in fact, his skeptical worries were much more profound than his answers or solutions to them. And if his skeptical worries were more profound than his solutions to them, where does that leave us epistemologically? Which is really the underlying question of epistemology. Uh, if we can't accept Descartes' conclusions, how do we know philosophically, again, not practically, how to overcome his doubts? How do we go about alleviating the doubts that Descartes initially brought up in the first meditation, if we can't find his solution viable. So this is something to consider. Um, thank you very much. I hope this was helpful, and hope to talk to you soon through email and Canvas. Take care.